Have you ever wondered, if all life started from some ancient prokaryotic organism a long time ago, well, why are there still bacteria today then? And if I evolved from some common ancestor with chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees? Well, in this video, we will talk about speciation. We'll talk about the answer to that question, how species change and differentiate over time. Let's get started. So, before we can talk about speciation, we have to talk about species. What is a species? So there's this biological species concept which says, a species is a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. All of these things are important for something to be a species. One, it must be able to interbreed. Two, those offspring that they produce must be viable, right? They must be lively, they must be able to live. And then those offspring must then be fertile and able to create their own offspring. So when we're talking about a species, as you can see here, I've got several examples of the human species or the Homo sapiens species. Of course, we're all one species. All of these individuals could interbreed, produce viable, fertile offspring. So, of course, we have a species of Homo sapiens. Let's look at another example. We have two birds here. The one on the left is an eastern meadowlark. The one on the right is a western meadowlark. So ask yourself the question, are these the same species? How would you know? Well, believe it or not, these are not the same species, because the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark have songs and behaviors that actually prevent them from breeding. Even though you look at them and say, Herder, those look exactly the same. Why aren't they the same species? Well, because they don't mate and produce viable, fertile offspring. Technically, these are two distinct species. So a general rule is, just because something looks similar doesn't mean it's the same species. And then in this case of Homo sapiens, there's a lot of diversity, but it is the same species. So we have to know, does it interbreed? Does it produce viable, fertile offspring? So how and why did new species originate? Well, here's the answers to this question. Isolation. How do we get new species? Isolation. The easy answer is isolation. That is, populations become isolated from each other and derivate into different species. So once those species have become isolated, they evolve independently of each other. A species isolated over here is going to evolve differently than the species isolated over here. So we break this isolation into two types. The first type is sympatric, meaning these species still live in the same area. If you break down the word sympatric, patriot, think like country, same. These are in the same country, living in the same area. Not literally same country, but that's what it means, right? Still in the same area. We also have allopatric, or other country, meaning they're not in the same place. There's some geographic separation. So if you look at this little graphic I've got for you, if time is moving this way, right, here's our original population in there. If some species, for example, becomes reproductively isolated, meaning that they prefer to mate with one particular type or one particular trait of an organism, they may isolate themselves from the rest of the population because their preference in reproduction. So even though they're living within the same population, speciation might occur because of the preference of mating. So that's an example of sympatric. Allopatric means there's separation. So here we have our original population. Then something happened. There was a barrier. Maybe a lake dried up in the center. You got some animals there, you got some animals over there. Over time, because they're not interacting anymore, they might become then reproductively isolated, so they wouldn't even mate. If you then took a fish out of here and tried to mate it with this group, they wouldn't mate anymore, they wouldn't breed, they became a different species, and you can see speciation occur. So these are the two main types: sympatric, same area; allopatric, different area. So let's look at all the things that are barriers to reproduction. So these are things that will cause isolation. And remember, it's isolation that leads to new species. So all of these things we're going to look at here in this video will lead to isolation. So we call these pre-reproduction barriers because these are barriers to mating or barriers before reproduction. So the first one is geographic. That means one species might be separated, maybe it's a mountain that separates them from each other, and they no longer mate, they become isolated. Temporal means a barrier in terms of time, right? We've got to watch there. One species likes to breed during this season, one species likes to breed during this season. They became isolated because of their temporal reproductive barrier. Another that we commonly see is behavioral barriers. This song singing a certain bird that other birds might like and want to mate with, but other ones might say no, right? So there might be a behavioral barrier. The next one is mechanical. This has to do with anatomy and do the parts of reproduction work, right? Do the parts, the specific reproductive organs fit with each other? And then the last one we're going to talk about is gametic. This has to do, of course, with the sperm and the egg. Can the gametes actually fertilize each other? So these are the 5 pre-reproduction barriers that we're going to look at in this video. So let's get started with the first one. First one is geographic. So this means there's a literal isolative mechanism between the two species. We call this allopatric because it's a physical barrier to separation. And in this example, I give you sort of a timeline example here, where you see, all right, we have 2 mountain peaks, and the species, the population of the species took up that whole area, all in blue. Well, maybe at some point the connection, there was a river or something that formed, or there was a climate change event which made the species only be able to survive up high. Well, over time, because these species were isolated, physically separated from each other, this one evolved into one species, this one evolved into a different species. Down here, the same thing could take place, except the isolation became down in the valley. So maybe you had a species which sort of occupied all of this area at one time. Over time, because maybe another climate change issue or a mountain range forming, what you see here is that the species might have become separated or isolated, which meant these over here no longer interbred with these. Over time, through years of evolution, they would no longer breed anymore, so they became separate species. Let me give you a very good specific example of this happening. If you ever go to the Grand Canyon, there are these antelope squirrels, right? There's squirrels all over the place. Well, it just so happens Amospermophilus is a particular type of squirrel of which there we see a few different species. Amospermophilus harisi, they are on the south rim of the canyon. Amospermophilus leucurus is on the north rim of the canyon. And so what you see over time, these became separated. So at one point long ago, they could mate, right? They were the same species. But because of the separation in the Grand Canyon, this one was separated from this one, and they took their own evolutionary journey this way, they took their own evolutionary journey this way, and now they're separate species. If you put the two together, Leucurus and Harisi, they would not be able to mate. So this isolation, this geographic barrier, caused speciation, new species being formed. So here's another prime example of a species, lions and tigers, right? Oh my. Lions and tigers could hybridize. So long ago, right, these species were very similar, lived in the same area, but because they occupy different habitats, we know lions like Africa, the grasslands. Tigers we find in the rainforest. And what we know is that at some point in our past, these two could actually get together. In parts of Eurasia, we've actually spotted some in India together. And so if they came together over there, right, they came from over there and they fell in love and mated, right, little heart, then they could actually produce what? A liger. There they are, right? So lions and tigers could hybridize and form these ligers that you see there. We see a female and a male liger, a combination of a lion and a tiger. But because they're now separated by their habitat, one in the grassland, one in the rainforest or the forest, they no longer interact. So those species became isolated and eventually became different species. Lions, tigers. Okay, so the next example is about time. So another way species can become isolated is by the time of day they breed, maybe a season they breed, or even a different year. So not all sexually reproducing organisms breed or reproduce at the same time. This is an example of sympatric speciation because these species can live in the same space, but because they prefer different mating times, they actually were isolated and became different species. So here's a cute little cartoon. You got one plant here. He's calling this other plant over here, hey, you want to pollinate? You want to reproduce? No response. Why? Because these might fertilize or pollinate at different times of the year. And so we don't have to worry about cross-pollination so much between these species because they fertilize or they pollinate, reproduce at different times of the year. So that's in the plant world. Another famous example is the eastern and the western spotted skunk. These skunks, you can see their ranges actually overlap in the middle a bit, so they could mate, they could come in contact with each other. But what we know is the western spotted skunk over here mates in the late summer. The eastern spotted skunk in the late winter. So if these two found each other, sure they could mate, but one might be in the mood to mate and one might not, depending on the time. So because they breed or they mate at different times, they become isolated. And as we know, isolation leads to speciation. So the next example is one of my favorite, behavioral. This is when an animal has a specific behavior or ritual that helps it identify members of its species and attract. We see this a lot in birds specifically. Think if you're a bird trying to find another bird to mate with, you're going to sing your song. And so you want to listen, the birds listen, and they'll only mate with birds singing their song, right? And we often see even it taken farther with these elaborate courtship rituals. I would encourage you to Google the blue-footed booby here and look at their courtship rituals. They do these elaborate, often looking quite silly, courtship displays unique to their species, which attract mates of their own species. So they won't, if this is the female, this is probably the male that's doing this ritual. But if you're a female blue-footed booby and you're looking to mate, you don't want to waste your time trying to mate and all that energy with a species that's not your own, right? So they developed over time these elaborate rituals for identification. I want to make sure that you're worth my time. Okay, sound familiar? Another really interesting example, of course, besides the birds, will be some tree hoppers. Before I talk about those, let me just reiterate this behavioral isolation in birds. So if this bird is singing this song, right? I'm not going to sing it for you. And this bird is like, that's not my song, right? They're not going to mate. This poor bird's left out. But if you got another bird that does sing the right song, right? Got the right pitches, got the right order, they will mate. Now, this is not just in birds. We find this in another species called the tree hopper. Doesn't look like a crazy little organism there. So the tree hopper is quite diverse. And here you can see a representation of lots of different types of tree hoppers. Well, if you're a tree hopper in the forest with lots of other tree hoppers, how do you know which one to mate with? Well, believe it or not, they listen very carefully for their particular signal. And so, as you can see here, there's been a lot of studies on Echinopominatata. And what you can see here is that if you're looking at their song that they're singing, or their mating call, you might say, they're different for the different subtypes. So in this case, you have Echinopa binotata salastrus, but notice that's very different than the wave pattern of Cerces. So I've got a little example here for you I'm going to play. This particular one is E. binotata telea. I think the P is silent. So we'll listen to that. Notice the distinct long and then two short bursts. Quite fascinating. If you're a tree hopper listening for this, right, and you hear this one instead of this one, you're going to say, nope, no mating. This is about recognizing your own species. So this is another way that organisms become isolated from each other based on the behavior, in this case, the reproductive song. So the next example of pre-reproductive barriers is mechanical isolation. This is when some morphological difference, right, some shape difference, some physical shape characteristic prevents successful mating. And sometimes we kind of crudely say this is like the bits don't fit, right? Meaning the parts don't quite work together. So let me give you an example of some mimulus flowers, right? Same type of flower, same family, mimulus, but notice they're very different shapes of flower. And what we know is that the shape of the flower and the color of the flower attracts different pollinators. So if you've got a different appearance in a flower, you might have a different pollinator, which means you're not going to get cross-pollination. So for example, let's say that we've got a hummingbird that's going to come over. There it comes. Which flower is it going to get? Okay, it's going to get this one right here, and then it will probably go to other flowers as well. And we know that's how a lot of plants reproduce, is that pollinators carry the pollen, the sexual reproductive mechanism, over to the other flowers, and they go through sexual reproduction. If you look at this other flower down here, maybe, oh, the bee's going up there. Oh, didn't like that one. Ah, there it goes. It likes this particular flower down here. So because flowers with different shapes and different colors and different scents attract different pollinators, cross-pollination doesn't happen. So this is an example of changes in the species affecting whether or not they can breed. In this case, these two flowers don't breed. Over time, they became separate species. So one of my favorite examples of this is these cute little snails, right? These snails, Bradybana. And what we know about them is that even though they're in the same family, we see that their sexual parts don't fit together. Their sex organs, the male and female sex organs, actually don't fit together, right? There's what I said earlier. The bits don't fit. The parts just don't work together. They don't fit together, and so they can't reproduce. And remember, to be a species, you must be able to produce viable, fertile offspring. So here, for an example, we've got one snail coming in here, right? And he's looking for a mate. And then we've got another snail coming in here. Maybe they're in the same family. They're both Bradybana. But there's the question, will they mate? In this particular case, they won't, or they may try even, but they will not have baby snails because their sex organs didn't fit together. So because of this isolative mechanism between the mechanics of sexual reproduction, we're going to see that these species will evolve into different entities. Okay, and the last example in pre-reproductive barriers is gametic isolation. So this is all about the gametes, and you know sperm and egg are our gametes that we're talking about. So this is when the sperm of one species is not able to fertilize the egg of another. And this could take two mechanisms. One, the sperm just can't penetrate the egg, right? The sperm may find the egg, but it can't get into the egg and pass on its DNA. The other mechanism of gametic isolation is chemical incompatibility. So if the sperm's on its way in the female reproductive tract and maybe it just can't survive because of some harsh chemicals, that's another way of preventing reproduction. So let me give you some examples. If you ever go to the Great Barrier Reef, which I had a really fortunate chance to do, there's something that happens every year called the coral spawning. So coral, right? These are animals. A lot of people don't think that. Coral animal? Yeah, it sure is. They sexually reproduce. So how do they reproduce, right? Does the coral move to other coral, and how do they sexually reproduce? Well, actually what they do is they just release their sperm into the water, coral spawning, and then it travels, right, to other members of their species, and once it finds the right species, it will fertilize it. So this would be a mess if any coral could fertilize any coral. Well, that's not the way it works. This coral spawning works when they all release at the same time because the sperm of one coral can only penetrate the egg of the same species, right? And so this is another way of preventing or preventing the reproduction. It's an isolative mechanism. And then take, for example, some sea urchins. So let's say you've got a purple sea urchin and you've got a red sea urchin. You might say, oh, those can breed together, right? Actually, they can't. What we find is that these sea urchins, when they release the sperm, they can only fertilize other sea urchins that are in their same species. So the gametes, the sperm and the egg, can't combine. The last example that I want to mention to you, I'm seeing this more and more, is something called polyploidy. So remember, humans, we are diploid. We have two sets of each of chromosomes. And sometimes plants, and we see this mostly in plants, if a plant cross-fertilizes, right? So you've got one plant here that's got a diploid number of chromosomes, 28 total, 28 chromosomes here. This plant, a diploid number of 14. Well, they may get together, cross-pollinate, and you might get a hybrid, right? Some hybrid plant. But notice it would have a different number of chromosomes as either of the original. So this is another way of preventing species. So you may make this hybrid flower or this hybrid plant from these two crosses, but you can't take the sperm and the egg of this one and cross-pollinate, or the pollen, and cross-pollinate and make new plants that are the exact same of this, because this was a hybrid of these two. Very similar to like the liger, right? You could take a lion and a tiger, hybridize them, you make a liger, but liger and another liger can't make a baby liger. Same way, this polyploidy situation plays out, and often some hybrids can't combine with the same hybrid to make another hybrid. So this prevents the gametes from joining. So now that we talked about the pre-reproduction barriers, I want to spend the last part of this podcast on post-reproductive barriers. These are barriers after mating. So the organism's mated, but this is going to prevent them from continuing to stay in the same species or to create new species. So we call this post-reproductive barrier. One way is reduced hybrid viability, meaning if two salamanders came together to make this salamander, well, this one might not be viable. It might not survive. So the fact that hybrids between two species have less viability is one way. The second one is reduced hybrid fertility. And we're going to see this example with the mules. So just because you've got two species coming together to make a hybrid, the hybrids, the mule in this case, are infertile. They can't make more mules. And the third example we're going to look at, or at least think about, is the hybrid breakdown. Hybrid breakdown is when you might find, and we see this a lot in this example I'm going to, here is rice. Certain rice plants that have been hybridized taste or quality. Those hybrids break down over time. So the breakdown of the hybrid ensures that this hybrid doesn't become a new species and then make more of the hybrid. Okay, so let me just talk about each of these and wrap this up for you. So as I mentioned, reduced hybrid viability. If you get genes from different species, the new baby might not develop. And so here, like I mentioned, you have one salamander fell in love with another salamander. It's different species though, right? They made a little baby salamander, but it wasn't very viable. It didn't survive. So this is one way of keeping species isolated because their hybrids don't survive. Another example, oh, I gave you this. I want to give you the name. This is salamander in the subspecies Insatina. They can hybridize, but their hybrids rarely develop, as you see there. So then another way is, okay, let's say we get a zebra with 44 chromosomes. We mate that with a horse, a female, 64 chromosomes. What do they form? Actually, a zebroid. Isn't that cute? So did you know we can take a zebra and a horse? Zebra has 44 chromosomes. Horse has 64. But look at this, a zebroid has 54, kind of split in the middle, right? So this hybrid is viable, it's strong, but it's infertile. So you can't take one zebroid with another zebroid and have baby zebroids. So reduced hybrid fertility keeps these species separate. The zebra is a separate species than the horse because their hybrids are infertile. And another of my examples, the most common one you would think of, is you take another horse and you take a donkey. Horse got 64 chromosomes, donkey 62. What do they make? Horse and a donkey make a mule. Stubborn as a mule, right? And these are viable. They're strong. They're sturdy. But because they have different chromosome number, they have variations in chromosome number, they cannot actually reproduce with each other. So the hybrid, a mule, cannot mate with another mule to form a baby mule. So we call it reduced hybrid fertility. They are not as fertile. So in wrapping up this speciation podcast, I want to mention to you that speciation occurs at different rates. So you might be saying, all right, I know all life came from some ancient prokaryotic sort of deal, a long time ago, bacteria-esque thing. What was the rate? How long did that take? How long does it take new species to arise? Well, what we know is that the rates vary wildly, especially when we see adaptive radiation like we did with Darwin finches. You may remember Darwin's finches. We suspect that adaptive radiation occurred and they needed to change pretty fast to adapt to that new environment when a new habitat became available. So speciation probably occurred pretty fast. So the current debate, is really about these two terms: punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. So this is the sort of more modern theory, and that's the idea. Look at your chart here. You've got time here, so as time goes on, we're talking millions of years. Morphology means change away, right? Change in shape, change in the organism. So in punctuated equilibrium, what we're saying is there's a long time with no change. Notice this is a straight line up. It doesn't deviate to the right or left. And so let me use some butterflies as an example. So let's say this is our original butterfly. If a long time passed and nothing changed, you'd have a butterfly that looked pretty much the same. But then maybe a new habitat was introduced. Some adaptive radiation mechanism was in play. What might happen is, even in a short amount of time, you might get some big changes, right? So this one sort of moves here. We're starting to get something here. The color changes a bit. Here, a little bit of changes around the edge, right? Then, once again, you have a long period of no change. And so what we might see there is the same thing going there. We might see the same thing evolving here, long time of no change. But then something else happened, something major, right? Some big event. Maybe it was a new habitat or some new exposure. Well, what might happen in this case? We could see a rapid change into something different. Over there, another rapid change. Notice that there was a big change, morphology, big change, but very little time over which that happened. So punctuated equilibrium means there's long periods of no change, but then that's punctuated by periods of quick change. So the other theory that's debated is what we call gradualism. So the other one here is gradualism. So if we start with, again, one species, over long periods of time, it's changing slowly into this, right? And then some isolative mechanism occurs. Some started going that way, some started going this way. Maybe they become physically separated. So we see, okay, some changes there. We see this one changing in a different direction. Then there's another event, right, that occurs and they split again. Gradualism is just slow, gradual changes over time. This one slowly got a little darker here. This one just had some slow changes. Looks like it got some lines. Slow, gradual changes over time. Same thing on this side, right? This one, the orange kind of took over time. Here we got a little lighter in the coloration. Slow changes over time. So the big difference, punctuated equilibrium. Long changes or long time of no change, punctuated by short bursts of rapid change. Gradualism is just small little incremental changes over time. Okay, so this is some current debate in the field of speciation. And then, how does extinction affect or impact speciation? Well, what we know is that species extinction rates are rapid when there's ecological stress. So in this example here, I've got, this happens to be a marine biodiversity graph, so we're looking at some marine life. And you can see 540-some million years ago, look at the diversity of species, pretty low. It's gradually gone up, but notice some big events occurred. We're getting a lot of species here, and then look, one of the big 5 mass extinctions took us down. Everywhere you see one of these yellow triangles, there was a mass extinction, right? Look at the diversity, goes way down. Look at the diversity, goes way down. Even up here, it started to go down. Diversity goes down. This kind of looks like a stock market graph for those of you that trade in the stock market. So there are these big events where the species diversity went down. Now, one of the interesting things we find out, though, is that if you look here, often when there's a big event and the species diversity goes down, notice there's generally a rebound. Because what happens is when there's some extinctions, that often opens up new niches, new roles in these habitats that are exploited by other species. So other species who had sort of maybe been repressed could now start to flourish, right? And this is one of the big things we suspect that happened with mammals when the extinction of the dinosaurs happened. There was a new niche now open for mammals that we could occupy after that asteroid hit. So this graph is about extinction. And what we know is that these extinction rates have occurred in our past and probably will continue to occur. But when they do occur, new species often emerge because there are new niches that are opened up. Hopefully that helped you understand how we get new species and this process of speciation. If you enjoyed the video or you found it interesting, learned something, feel free to subscribe to the channel and like the video so that I will continue to make more videos for you.